imagine sitting in a courtroom, right? You are mourning your murdered teenage daughter, and you're watching the literal serial killer who confessed to her murder-stand trial.
Yeah, and the details of his confession have been public for years at this point.
Exactly. Like, you've already held a memorial service for her. You've accepted the absolute darkest possible reality. And then, right in the middle of the proceedings, the prosecutor stands up and announces a twist that just stops the trial cold.
Which is that your daughter is not actually dead.
Right. She is currently sitting in a bedroom cupboard,
Yeah.
completely alive, just a few miles away. So welcome to the Deep Dive. We are so glad you're here. Today we're looking at a story that honestly sounds like a rejected Hollywood thriller script because it's just too bizarre.
But I assure you it is entirely true. It really is one of the most astonishing legal and media spectacles of the last few decades.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's start by setting the baseline tragedy because the context of time and place is everything here. It is August 1998 in Rockhampton, which is a city in Queensland, Australia.
Right. A 14-year-old girl named Natasha Ryan, affectionately nicknamed Grasshopper by her dad, which is just heartbreaking. She's dropped off at school by her mom, and she simply vanishes.
Now, it's important to note right up front that she did have a history of running away.
Yeah, just the month prior to this disappearance, she was found at an outdoor music venue. She had been staying at a local motel with her boyfriend, Scott Black, and Scott was 21 or 22 at the time.
So initially, police look at this and think, okay, it's just another runaway situation, a rebellious teenager blowing off steam.
But then the days turn into weeks, and the weeks turn into months.
And that is where the context of Rockhampton in the late 90s becomes absolutely crucial, because the local fear in this community is rising exponentially.
Because other women are vanishing. Right.
Exactly. There is a predator operating in the area. Enter Leonard John Fraser, known in the press as the Rockhampton Rapist.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He is a convicted predator who had recently been released from prison, and he is eventually caught for the horrific murder of a 9-year-old girl named Kira Steinhardt.
And he's also tied to the murders of 2 other women, plus 1 manslaughter, if I remember the sources correctly.
That's right. So put yourself in the shoes of the local police. They are under immense pressure.
I mean, the community is absolutely terrified.
Yes, and they have a known, highly dangerous predator in custody. They have a list of missing girls, and they desperately want closure.
So they put the pressure on Fraser, and eventually he confesses to 5 murders. And you guessed it, one of them is Natasha Ryan.
He claims he offered her a ride, attacked her in his car, and hit her body.
And to make this even more seemingly ironclad, a fellow inmate steps forward. This inmate actually testifies that Fraser drew detailed maps pointing right to where he buried Natasha's remains.
Her family is so utterly devastated that they actually hold a memorial service for her on her 17th birthday in 2001.
The entire community mourned her. The narrative was completely set in stone. Fraser was the monster, and Natasha was his tragic victim.
But I have to push back on how neat and tidy this confession was.
Why is that?
It feels like the police investigation was a puzzle, and they just forced a piece to fate simply because the colors matched.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Think about the mechanics of this. If there is no physical body, no crime scene, no forensic evidence tying him to her whatsoever, how does a supposedly rigorous justice system just accept a hand-drawn map by a prison inmate as gospel truth?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Griffith Law Review article outlines exactly how this mechanism works. It's a psychological phenomenon called tunnel vision.
Tunnel vision, like they just can't see anything outside their one theory?
Exactly. The article explicitly notes that when police believe they know who the perpetrator is, they can become so intensely focused on proving that theory that all other possibilities just evaporate.
The police were desperate for closure in a terrified town. They needed to win.
Right, but what about Fraser? Why on earth would someone confess to a murder they didn't commit, especially a murder of a child, which carries massive stigma and a huge penalty?
The sources suggest it really comes down to the brutal reality of prison dynamics and interrogation pressure. The Law Review article details how false confessions are often extracted.
It's rarely someone just volunteering for punishment, right?
Oh, absolutely not. It involves intense psychological pressure, leading questions where detectives accidentally feed the suspect details of a crime, or, in Fraser's case, attempting to manipulate the system.
He likely confessed in an apparent deal with police to avoid being put in the general prison population.
Right, because his life would be in immediate danger given his actual crimes against a child.
And furthermore, that map drawn by a fellow inmate That relies on what the justice system calls informer evidence or jailhouse snitches.
Which are highly unreliable witnesses who fabricate stories to get time shaved off their own sentences.
The system basically prioritized a neat resolution over actual truth.
It's terrifying when you realize the machinery of justice can run on such flimsy fuel. But the case is officially solved. Fraser is charged, and we fast forward to April 2003.
We are in a courtroom in Brisbane on the 12th day of Leonard Fraser's murder trial.
The prosecution is presenting its case. The family is reliving their absolute nightmare. And here's where it gets really interesting.
It is arguably one of the most shocking courtroom moments in Australian legal history.
So about 3 weeks prior to this moment in court, a girl calling herself Sally contacts a kid's helpline. She tells the operator she's a runaway, she's living with her boyfriend, and get this, a man is currently on trial for her murder.
This anonymous tip, along with a traced phone number, leads police to raid a house in North Rockhampton on April 10th.
The house belongs to Scott Black, the older boyfriend from years ago who is now working as a local milkman.
The police force entry into the house, and inside they find Natasha Ryan.
She is now 18 years old. She is cowering in a bedroom cupboard, and reporters at the time noted her skin was bleached white from a sheer lack of sunlight.
She had been missing for 4.5 years.
And the very next day, back in that Brisbane courtroom, prosecutor Paul Rutledge stands up and stuns the entire room by announcing that Leonard Fraser is not guilty of Natasha's murder because she is alive.
Natasha's father, Robert, almost collapses when he hears the news.
To confirm it's really her, he gets on the phone with the police and asks the girl on the other end for her childhood nickname.
And she replies, "Dad, it's me, Grasshopper, and I love you and I'm sorry."
It is hard to wrap your head around the psychological whiplash her family must have experienced. It's like attending your own child's funeral, but in reverse. You spend nearly 5 years processing the grief of a murdered child.
You hold a memorial. You sit in a courtroom to see her killer brought to justice.
And in one single phone call, you are thrust into profound shock, confusion, and inevitably anger.
The legal whiplash was just as intense and honestly a bit baffling.
What do you mean by baffling?
Well, what's fascinating here is the immediate legal fallout of that courtroom announcement. Despite this glaring, undeniable inconsistency, the fact that Fraser's confession about Natasha was demonstrably, objectively false. Fraser's defense team didn't even file for a mistrial.
Wait, hold on. How does a jury just unhear a detailed confession to a murder that literally didn't happen?
It's wild, isn't it?
If I'm the defense attorney, I am screaming from the rooftops that if the police fabricated or coerced a confession for Natasha, they could have done the exact same thing for the other victims.
You would definitely think so. But the trial just resumed for the other murders. Fraser was ultimately convicted of the other crimes based on separate evidence.
But you are absolutely right to point out the cognitive dissonance there. The illusion of the infallible police confession was completely shattered.
The public just watched a man go to trial for the brutal murder of a girl who was literally sitting in a house a few kilometers away, eating breakfast and learning German.
Which brings us to the reality of what those 4.5 years actually looked like. Because the media immediately dubbed her the girl in the cupboard.
And that moniker is incredibly powerful.
It really is. It conjures this horrifying image of a hostage stuffed in a tiny, dark wooden box for half a decade.
But the 60 Minutes interview with Natasha revealed a very different, much more complex reality. The physical mechanism of her hiding wasn't what the tabloids suggested at all.
Right. She wasn't locked in the cupboard for 5 years. She freely roamed the house, though always with the heavy curtains drawn tight.
She studied German on the internet, she learned to sew, she even visited the beach, but only under the cover of absolute darkness at midnight.
She said she only hid in that famous cupboard for maybe an hour at a time when Scott had visitors over or a tradesman came to the house.
In the interview, she claimed she was free and that she actively chose to stay hidden.
When they asked why she didn't just walk out the front door, she said she was terrified of the consequences of running away. She genuinely thought she'd be sent to prison or some kind of bad place because she had caused so much trouble.
But the public reaction in 2003, upon hearing she was essentially just hanging out in her boyfriend's house, was not exactly sympathetic.
No, the backlash was incredibly fierce, and it focused heavily on civic duty and economics. Like, local state emergency service volunteer Lyle Dobbs publicly pointed out that the massive, exhaustive search for her cost taxpayers anywhere from $151,000 to $400,000.
People who had spent their weekends trudging through bushland looking for her body were absolutely furious about the wasted resources and the sheer deception.
And that anger completely boiled over when Natasha signed a reported $120,000 media deal with Publishing and Broadcasting Limited.
That was for exclusive interviews with 60 Minutes and Women's Day, right?
Yes, exactly. Meanwhile, the legal system doles out its punishments for the deception. Scott Black gets a 3-year sentence for perjury. He ultimately serves 12 months for explicitly lying to the police under oath about knowing where she was.
And Natasha is found guilty of causing a false police investigation and is fined $1,000.
So in 2003, the narrative was very much, these are two deceptive kids who wasted police time and cashed in on the notoriety.
But as we look at this through a modern lens, thanks to the Reddit thread from 2024 included in our sources, the framing shifts dramatically.
Oh, completely. It raises a really pointed point about agency. The Reddit users strongly push back against that 2003 media framing.
This raises an important question, really. They point out a basic, glaring fact that the early 2000s media largely glossed over. This was a 14-year-old child who ran off with a 22-year-old man.
Exactly. I keep returning to this idea of a psychological funhouse mirror. To a distressed 14-year-old teenager, escaping the pressures of home with an older boyfriend might look like a romantic Romeo and Juliet adventure.
It looks like freedom.
But the reality is, it's a cage built by an adult. Can a 14-year-old legally or morally consent to disappearing from the world for 5 years?
That's the core issue.
How does a 22-year-old convince a child that she will be sent to a bad place if she leaves, unless he is actively controlling her perception of reality?
That is the exact mechanism of coercive control. The Reddit retrospective frames her time in the house not as a vacation, but as a classic grooming scenario.
Because the adult holds all the power, all the resources, and dictates the terms of reality.
The sources emphasize that it is our job to impartially present how these societal views have shifted over time. In 2003, the dominant public narrative was outrage over tax dollars and media deals.
Right, whereas the 2024 discussion focuses entirely on the failure of society to recognize grooming.
In fact, some Reddit users compared the misogynistic media frenzy surrounding Natasha to the treatment of Lindy Chamberlain.
Oh, wow. That's a really powerful comparison for those familiar with Australian history.
It really is.
For those who aren't, Lindy Chamberlain was the mother who famously claimed a dingo took her baby in the 1980s. The media and the public completely turned on her, painting her as a cold-blooded murderer based on junk science and misogynistic assumptions about how a grieving mother should act.
She was wrongfully convicted and spent years in prison before the baby's jacket was found near a dingo lair, proving she was telling the truth the whole time.
It was a massive media witch hunt.
Exactly. And the Reddit users draw a parallel there. They argue that the media treated Natasha Ryan not as a child victim of an adult's manipulation, but as a lying runaway who didn't perform the role of the grateful, traumatized victim they expected.
The societal understanding of victimhood, isolation, and the incredibly imbalanced power dynamics between a child and an adult has clearly evolved significantly over the last 2 decades.
It's a profound shift in how we view the exact same set of facts. We no longer see a rebellious teen taking advantage of the system.
Right. We see a vulnerable child hidden away by an adult during her most formative years. Hearing how easily the public blamed her makes me wonder about the police, though.
In what way?
I want to bring this back to the Griffith Law Review article. If the police were so easily fooled by a false confession, how often does this happen when the victim doesn't miraculously reappear? Like, what if that anonymous kid's helpline tip was never made?
If that tip never happens, Leonard Fraser is convicted of her murder. Full stop. The Law Review article uses this case to highlight the broader systemic crisis of wrongful convictions.
The researchers estimate that roughly 1% of convictions are wrongful. Right.
It's about 1%.
Wait, 1% sounds like a rounding error. It sounds like
Yeah.
the system gets it right 99% of the time. Why is that a crisis?
Because of the sheer volume of people in the system, 1% might sound small on paper, but when you apply that to a justice system processing tens of thousands of individuals,
Right.
that translates to hundreds, potentially thousands of innocent people currently sitting in Australian prisons or prisons anywhere in the world. It is the equivalent of an entire populated town of innocent people locked behind bars.
That brings me back to that puzzle piece metaphor. We talked about how earlier on, usually when we talk about the justice system, there is this expectation of precision.
Like a medical diagnosis.
Exactly. Yeah. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and that doctor just points and says, there it is, broken. It's comforting.
We want the X-ray machine of truth to just spit out a clear picture.
But the law review article shatters that X-ray machine. It shows us that detectives aren't always looking at objective X-rays. They are looking at puzzle pieces. And sometimes they take a hammer to a piece to force it into the hole because they just really need to close a case.
And the sources point out that we can't just rely on science to fix this. The Griffith article notes that while we treat DNA testing as this magic bullet that solves everything and exonerates the innocent,
It's actually only applicable in about 20% of serious offenses. Not every crime leaves behind biological evidence.
which means for the other 80% of serious crimes, we are relying on exactly the kind of evidence that nearly convicted Leonard Frazier of Natasha's murder.
Precisely. For that 80%, the system relies on inherently flawed human memory and eyewitnesses.
It relies on jailhouse informers trading lies for lighter sentences.
It relies on, potentially bad defense lawyering or incorrect scientific evidence.
Natasha's case is the ultimate cautionary tale. It featured an overzealous investigation desperate for a result, reliance on highly unreliable informer evidence, and the terrifying malleability of truth when someone is locked in an interrogation room.
This makes the arduous, unglamorous investigative work of Innocence Projects absolutely vital, because they are the ones looking at the 80% of cases where DNA can't save the day.
So we have this massive systemic failure exposed, we have a public up in arms about wasted money, and at the center of it all is a young woman trying to figure out how to exist in the world again.
How does a person even begin to rebuild a life after spending 5 years in the shadows and then being thrust onto the front pages of every newspaper?
The sources bring us up to the present day, and it's a deeply poignant conclusion. After the trial and the fines, Natasha and Scott Black actually stayed together.
Wait, really? They stayed together?
Yeah. In 2008, they got married. They reportedly sold the wedding story to the media for another $200,000, which, as you can imagine, fueled another round of public ire at the time.
I can imagine.
But after that final media payday, she really tried to distance herself from being the girl in the cupboard.
She changed her name to Tash Black. She went back to school, she became a radiology nurse, and she had 4 children.
By all accounts, from the local community, she was a devoted mother, a highly respected and hardworking nurse, and someone who just wanted to live a quiet, peaceful life after making massive mistakes in her youth.
But tragically, on June 2, 2024, at the age of 40, Natasha was found dead at the Rockhampton Golf Club during a police welfare check.
The authorities quickly ruled out foul play.
It's a somber end to a life that was intensely scrutinized. The public and the media were so obsessed with the sensationalism of her disappearance. The covered, the serial killer, the money, the deception.
But reading the tributes from her friends and colleagues in the recent news reports, her legacy is ultimately that of a complex human being.
She was deeply loved by your family, and she clearly outgrew the one-dimensional moniker the media slapped on her when she was just a teenager.
It really makes you reflect on how easily society flattens people into their absolute worst moments.
Completely. She survived 5 years hiding in a house, terrified of the outside world, then stepped directly into the blinding, glaring spotlight of a global media circus.
She faced criminal charges, national hatred, and the bizarre reality of her own supposed murder trial.
And despite all of that trauma, she still managed to build a life of service as a nurse.
It is a testament to human resilience. She navigated an extraordinary set of circumstances, some of her own making, some shaped by the adult who controlled her environment, and some manufactured by a justice system desperate for answers.